Everyone. I think everyone's joining now.
Okay, perfect. Oh, folks are coming in. I see. Hi, everybody. Welcome. We'll get started in 30 seconds. Give folks time to come in. Welcome to our webinar, From Crisis to Action, Combating the Criminalization of Youth Homelessness After Grants Pass. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to start with a welcome. We have a lot of folks here today, so if you could please introduce yourself in chat. Please say your name, pronouns, organization, where you're located in the world, and throw in an emoji of how your day is going so far. Also, we will have time for Q&A at the end. So as you have questions throughout today's presentation, please put your questions in chat. Also, the webinar slides and the link for today's slides are actually available already. If you look at the resources button at the bottom of the screen, you can already access the slides. And then we also have a document that includes all the links that are in the slides today. Also, the recording and the slides and other resources are going to be available on our website. Some are already there, and we'll share that link later on. Also, we will have a survey at the end of the webinar. Please fill out that survey. It really helps us improve and know what kind of content you all are interested in for us to provide. So again, welcome. My name is Darla Bardine. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Executive Director of the National Network for Youth. I live in Maryland in the Washington, D.C. area. For those of you who aren't familiar with the National Network for Youth, we are on a mission to transform systems so that no young person in America experiences homelessness. We do this by partnering with young people with lived expertise and youth service providers, by advancing federal policy goals through advocacy and relationship building, and also advancing community-based solutions through our community strategies work. And we are proud to be co-hosting this webinar with the National Homelessness Law Center. And I will pass it over to Katie to share a little bit about her organization.
Hi, all. Good to see you all here today. I am Katie Scott, the Executive Director, or the Youth Homelessness Director of the National Homelessness Law Center. So the National Homelessness Law Center is a national organization that's really the legal arm of the movement to end homelessness. We do that through litigation. We do that through policy advocacy work, both to fiercely defend the rights of all unhoused persons, including youth, and also to advance federal, state, and local policies that ensure housing for all. And I will pass it back to Darla.
Awesome. Thanks, Katie. Basically, they're awesome, and we're very proud to partner with them. So we have amazing speakers for you today. Katie, who you just met, you're going to hear from Dane and Amara, Mark, and Christina as well. We have a lot to cover, so I'm moving through. Our agenda today will just be an overview and urgency of the issue that we're here to talk about, and then talking about really helping everybody understand the Supreme Court decision, executive orders, and ongoing legal fallout. Also impacts and insights from young people with lived expertise, and recommendations on what providers and allies can and should do now. And then at the end, we'll have a provider discussion, really hear from providers on the ground around their responses to criminalization, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So like I said, please put your questions in chat throughout. The National Network for Youth is a membership organization. If you are not a member, please consider joining our network. Also, I want to make sure everybody's aware, and please widely share that we have launched a vital document legal hotline for young people experiencing homelessness to help young people obtain access to their state ID and a license, social security card, birth certificate, or any document that's needed to obtain an ID or a license. We've partnered with Baker McKenzie Law Firm. You can text or call 1-888-870-DOCS. It's open on Wednesdays, but you can leave a voicemail or a text message and it will be returned. We have a lot of resources, amazing flyers that you can print out or you can share, social media posts, newsletters. Please, everybody help us spread the word so that young people and then those who are helping young people know about this resource. It does have resources for every state and U.S. territory. So young people can call, McKinney Eventual Liaisons, youth service providers, anybody can call to help a young person. So a little bit about why we're here today, a little bit of framing. I'm sure most of you are aware, but just wanting to level set, that over the past year and a half, there's been a number of federal efforts to criminalize homelessness. There was the City of Grants Pass versus Johnson that was decided on June 28th. That's when the Supreme Court decided that local governments can enforce laws against camping on public land, even if those laws include fines or jail time, and that this does not count as cruel and unusual punishment. And Katie's going to, dig into that more. Also, actually, after we started planning this webinar, unfortunately, an executive order was signed called Ending Crime and Disorder on America's Streets that was signed on July 24th that opens pathways for communities to use incarceration or involuntary treatment to keep unsheltered individuals off the streets and directs agencies to prioritize funding for states and communities that do so. Also, the recent Continuum of Care builds, NOFO, or Notice of Funding Opportunity, is the first that could be provide further financial incentives for states and communities to criminalize homelessness. Obviously this is a bit of a, doom, but all of these reasons are why it is really imperative for youth homelessness providers to be aware of these shifts that are happening at the federal level and to get resources on how you all can continue to provide comprehensive affirming services while advocating for local systems change. So our hope is that we are providing you with those resources and providing you with the most up-to-date legal information about what has shifted over the past year and a half and the impacts that have already started occurring. And with that, it is my pleasure to hand it over to Katie.
Hi, all. Thanks so much, Darla. We can go to the next slide. We'll dig right into it. So, how did we get here is sort of the first thing that I was going to talk about. And I just want to be really clear that this isn't an accident. This is a billionaire-backed plan to enrich people who make money off of, various systems of incarceration or institutionalization. And specifically the Cicero Institute, they started shopping around model policies, encouraging localities to criminalize people who are homeless. And so once that started happening, there was a lot of sort of cities were feeling quite emboldened to kind of push back about some of the legal protections that were gained, particularly through the Martin v. Boise case. Which basically said you couldn't criminalize someone if there's no room in shelter or if there is no shelter in the jurisdiction. Grants Pass actually went beyond that and essentially said that, criminalizing people for using a tent, a pillow, or even any a piece of cardboard that they're using to protect themselves from the elements, that's something that is okay to criminalize, even if there is no shelter available. So, it's not surprising that this led and, this was something that we knew was coming, the executive order that Darla mentioned. And, what flows from that is some of these other things as well, like DC and other takeovers, like in Chicago, Memphis, Portland. These are areas that have been threatened and where actions are currently happening. And then also just the intersection that we have here with ICE and immigration enforcement. Basically, administration is trying to pressure these localities to actually cooperate with immigration enforcement and to implement sort of their desires around criminalization of homelessness. So we'll move on. We won't spend too long on this slide because we want to get to some of the good things about what we can all do to prevent things. So just, the effect of Grants Pass, since then, there's been 320 bills that have been introduced across the country that make it a crime to be homeless. The good news that I'll share here is that when you, get these slides and you trick on the link that's at the bottom here to track criminalization efforts, you will see that not all of those were successful. And in fact, there's been some really, really promising victories against these kind of bills. There's also been bills introduced that try to decriminalize homelessness in jurisdictions, and we've seen success around that as well. So this isn't a lost cause. Legislative advocacy does work, both speaking out against criminalization and pushing for decriminalization or homelessness bills of rights. We can go on to the next slide. So I think the next slide, okay, so basically, what does the executive order do? It's basically saying that we want to make it easier to put homeless people with mental health disorders and substance use disorders behind bars in institutions, and particularly in institutions without their consent. It favors high barrier homelessness and housing programs. It's basically signaling an end, like this administration does not support housing first. It defunds and even criminalizes harm reduction programs such as needle exchanges, but really anything that falls within that harm reduction rubric, it's really hostile towards. It requires data sharing with law enforcement and makes it easier to share even sensitive health-related data, personally identifiable health-related data with the federal government. And then it attempts to defund programs in jurisdictions that don't criminalize homelessness. So if a jurisdiction doesn't have a camping ban or some other criminalization effort, it's saying we're not going to fund homelessness services in those jurisdictions. Next slide. And this is one I have to give all the credit to National Network for Youth for framing this slide, because this is really just like the simplest way to say it, and it's going to keep me out of my legal nonsense and trying to explain what an executive order can do and can't do. But what an executive order does not do, it does not erase people. It does not change current federal statutes or regulations. It doesn't change current state law or policy. So like all the federal laws and and state laws that you all, have to follow, those are still in place. And that is what our, clients deserve and are entitled to under the law, despite this executive order. It doesn't change professional standards or alter our obligation to treat youth and families with dignity and respect. And so this is just such a great reminder of the limits of the power of an executive order. And the technical legal thing, and we can go to the next slide, is that really executive orders only apply to federal agencies. That is what the president has power to direct. So just briefly, this, I'm not going to read everything out loud, but in the COC Builds NOFO that Darla explained, I wanted to make sure you sort of had all this information, because we are expecting to see this in the bigger COC grant agreements that come out. And so, we just want people to be aware and prepared. I mean, so much of what's in this NOFO is things that, like, how could, grantees even have control over some of this? Like, you don't have control over whether your jurisdiction cooperates or doesn't cooperate with immigration enforcement. It's just impractical on so many levels. And so we can move on to the next slide, but, just know that as with a lot of these grant agreement terms, federal funding opportunities that have come out, there's been successful litigation against. So, time after time, courts have found that what this administration is trying to do via executive order and via these grant agreements, that it is actually way beyond their powers. It is unconstitutional. It doesn't comply with the Administrative Procedures Act. And so we've had a lot of success with litigation so far. So we expect to see the same in some of the other funding opportunities that come out. So I will pause here. I think we can go to the next slide, and I think I am passing it first to Amara. Oh, maybe we'll just do a quick introduction on here. So we are going to talk about ways that providers address the harm that youth are feeling from criminalization efforts. And we really, really encourage you to try, especially things that are new to you, that like are things that you haven't tried before. We really encourage you to try them. So I think we'll go to the next slide, and I will have Amara introduce herself.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Katie, for that wonderful, technical and yet direct grounding on what's going on at the federal level. Every time you speak, I'm just learned so much. You're like a Law and Order episode, embodied in the best way possible. But hi everyone, my name is Nora Santos. My pronouns are she, her, and I am on the panel with Dane Valentine, and we're going to be talking a little bit about what service providers can be doing directly to support young people. So as you'll see on the slide, it says find and make connections with non-traditional partners. And that means connecting youth to mutual aid organizations, community organizers, grassroots legal aid, and other organizations and programs that may not be dependent or fully dependent on federal funding. And so I imagine I don't need to tell you all why marginalized communities or young people may not want to go to a public service. But I do think it's worthwhile to kind of explore why mutual aid specifically might be really appealing and much more accessible in this time. So similar reasons to nonprofits of lower barriers, inherent co-design, and kind of the distrust or discomfort they might feel with institutions. There's a lot of historical richness and trust with mutual aid. And as I say that term, I think it's really important to define how I use it. So there's a lot of different definitions, but the Solidarity Economy Association defines it as an effort where people come together to support one another, collectively meeting each other's needs without the help of official bodies like the state or NGOs. It often arises due to neglect of government provisions for certain groups of people. Historic examples look like the Marsha P. Johnson Star Housing and the Young Lords Healthcare Program that started in the 1970s in New York, and more locally, for me, based in California, the Black Panther Breakfast Party Program. These were everyday people seeing a need in their community and providing aid and support where they felt that they could, and again, in context of where they were at the time. Those are, as I said, like historical, but mutual aid programs are constantly popping up. I am a part of one myself with a handful of my community. We just provide each other and other people, specifically unhoused people in the Bay Area, food and large meals. And there is another really interesting effort that's happening out where Dane is in Oklahoma, and I will put that in the chat. And that's a really amazing colleague, and they do a lot of like grassroots mutual aid funding for various campaigns that people have. And so with that, where is the disconnect between service providers and where can there be some more connection? The service providers and social workers are often trained off a certain set of criteria to refer to someone, such as aging effectiveness, considering ROIs, and a lot of other kind of policy in-house assessments. And while that is like on the whole definitely supportive and with the interest of young people, sometimes if the service provider is unaware of the mutual aid programs or it does not necessarily fit the kind of structure or the kind of restrictions that come with the organization, that can mean that the young person is not connected to a resource that could have been really, really supportive for them, whether that's connecting them to employment, legal resources, or even just finding a community of other people. And so what I would encourage service providers is to consider how else they can talk about social impact and social change, and resource allocation doesn't necessarily look like a constant referral to other nonprofits in the area. It can look like that, but how do we understand the larger players and efforts so we can kind of take the burden off nonprofits and social workers and providers? And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dana to talk a little bit more about making that burden a little less for young people specifically.
Thank you so much, Mara. I always get a little nervous following you because you guys make really great points like they're just casual. That's kind of hard to follow up. Also, I wanted to say thank you for the spotlight to my very dear colleague, Marcellus Seals, who is the one who created and still currently runs OKC Reparations. They are a Black and Indigenous queer person from Oklahoma City and have done a lot of great work in our community. And I just love the ability to be able to speak to that. Myself, I am Dane Valentine. I use Z, Zer, and Zim pronouns. I have a lived experience advocate, and I've been doing this work. This is my 8th year in this field. I've done things both local community and also federal and national, and I've spent a lot of time speaking very loudly about the importance of youth voice, because it's not only fundamental to like developing a thoughtfully constructed and well-informed program, it's equally as crucial to be honoring the people that the voice is coming from, because they are people rather than just an information source. Um, it is, as the 3 points that are up front here are all very important. You know, speaking on how, while this is scary and hard work for those of us who have to see the black and white of it on paperwork, it's just as scary and even more so as a lived experience advocate going through this on both sides. Even currently, as I speak, I am still engaging with certain services. So as I am advocating for services and funding and, you know, trying to make things better and more youth centered, I am actively feeling the effects of the providers I'm speaking to either taking or not taking my input. So it is very important to remember that it's scary for everyone and to give that grace to youth advocates as well. The bottom point there of the point of recognizing advocates as people rather than tools. I think it's very easy to say that there's someone that we know, or there's someone in our agency that knows all about that. On more than one occasion, I have been recommended with the sentence, "We know someone who has an adultism training," which is great to be able to share that information. However, what you're doing is using that youth's voice as a tool to progress your own work rather than using that space that you have to bring that youth into the space and make it a collaborative effort to do the work. So really having that person first mindset of, rather than we know someone who has that expertise, it's important to remember that we're using their actual names or their community or their location or their agency, something that is actually an individual identifier, because it's so easy to lump in youth voice as something else that can be used or as another resource, but it just isn't that. I mean, youth advocates have feelings, experiences, and biases and perspectives and everything that any provider has. We just also have experience that you really can only get going through that, which does come with its own form of trauma. So we should be honoring that it's an experience that has brought these skill rather than it is a person who is used as a tool. Um, Something else that's really important to be looking at when you're trying to piece together an effort to have that, you know, very collaborative in an authentic way, kind of moving forward, is education. That, you know, it supports authentic allyship through education by making sure that youth who are on the entry level of these agencies and of this work are understanding what their rights are, not only as an employee, but as a client, and understanding how to explain that to other youth in a way that keeps everyone informed without it feeling like, either as a youth you don't have the education that you need, or feeling like the providers that are supposed to support you don't quite understand. So multi-level training of everyone receiving it, from director to new hires, is really important to bridge that gap of education between lived experience advocates who don't have the provider's experience and for providers who did not go through those services. And the final point that I think is imperative to keep at the front of mind when it comes to trying to share this work with youth advocates is understanding that while this is not exactly something that is old news in this field, to be collaborating with youth voice and actively using our spaces to include youth voice. I understand that in maybe the last 4 years that's become normal. So it is new and it is something to learn and to adjust to. And there is grace to be given. However, that'll go so far. You must still put better and trying to make this as smooth and normalized for yourself and your agency as possible. You cannot continuously use the excuse of, well, it's new, or we don't know how, or we're unsure, because those are all valid feelings, but not for years on end. It's so important to remember that we are all learning in a different way. Myself, as a lived experience advocate, I had to learn everything that I've learned in my career when it comes to policies and provider work, being in the same room And I've also worked with the same providers for years that had to ask me multiple questions on how to have that true, authentic collaboration. We're all learning and we're all trying to move forward towards the same goal, which is ending youth homelessness. But we cannot allow ourselves to lean too comfortably back on, well, I just don't know how, because without learning, there is no change. And change is important and required by any means necessary. I appreciate you for listening to me, and I hope that my words have kind of given you a perspective that maybe you might not have had, or maybe that could inform your work going forward. Thank you.
Incredible. Thank you so much, Jane and Amara. I really appreciate those insights. And, the only thing I would add just quickly is just ensuring that your program is not contributing to the criminalization of youth, right? Like, let's think about, criminalization, punitive approaches that are happening internally as well. And just could be a whole nother training, but, reminder that if you receive, Runaway and Homeless Youth Act funding, particularly, there should be no terminations. It's only safe and appropriate exits that is allowed under federal law. And so let's make that a reality for the youth that we are serving, is that only safe and appropriate exits. And that really only can happen in conversation with the young people with what they need. Okay, let's quickly move on so that we save enough time for our provider session, but let's do, we can go to the next slide, and I'm just going to quickly run through some tips of what you can do now. And we can even go to the next slide because I'll just say what each of these points are when we get it. So make sure that you have Know Your Rights materials handy for staff and for youth. We've got links for ICE Raid resources, Trans Equality Know Your Rights for trans and non-binary youth, school rights, and also what are your rights if you're stopped by the police. Have these, train on these, make sure staff and youth have access to this information. Next slide. Okay, build legal partnerships now. Do not wait. If you already don't know who you could call on, what attorney you could call on, either for the young people in your program or for you as an organization, it is time to make those connections. And it really does require sort of reaching out, figuring out who the legal aid is in your community. Do they work with youth? These links up here will help you figure out if we've already identified programs that work with youth directly. We've also got a link for programs that provide legal help for organizations. And again, we've got 2 specific email addresses up there. If you need help finding legal resources for youth, Kelly Russo is your person at the American Bar Association. And if you need help finding legal help for your organization, you can contact me directly and I will help you find someone. And we can go to the next slide. Strengthen documentation strategies and outreach efforts. So one thing, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, we don't have great data around youth and criminalization. That really seems to be a gap. I've shared some resources here from the Western Regional Advocacy Project around how they do their street outreach, different forms, different handouts, examples of ways that they've really and truly documented like what's going on in Denver for people who are unsheltered and as it relates to criminalization and other needs. So I've included those there. And then let's go to the next slide. These are various sample policies and messagings that your communities can use. So we've got the Housing Not Handcuffs policy solutions that helps with like combating criminalization efforts. We've got the Gloria Johnson template legislation that's to try to pass decriminalization laws in your community, communication toolbox with a lot of different links and recommendations. And then we've also got the model state statutes and policies. It includes a section on criminalization that you all can use, especially as it relates to youth, but also a lot of other really great policies as well that, help prevent homelessness, which I think will also help with preventing criminalization. And we'll go to the next slide. Oh, yes. Does Amara or Dane want to just mention what's going on this slide? I'm also happy to take it if you would like.
Yeah, so this is just oh, did you want to say something, Katie? Okay. we'll tag it if I miss anything, and Dane as well. This is something that was created with our supervisor who's on the call today. So shout out to Alex. And this was just to kind of understand, try to collect some data on understanding what's going on with criminalization efforts to decriminalize across the nation, and just understanding where service providers are in that process. And if they're not in that data collection stage yet, what could be preventing that, and how could people on the call, our council, kind of collaborate with them to figure out other solutions, data-driven ones specifically. Did I miss anything, Katie?
Nope, that was perfect. Thank you so much, Amara, for jumping in and doing that. And then next slide, I think we might be coming to the end of our section. All right, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. I'll pass it back to Dar.
Thank you so much to Katie, Amara, and Dane for sharing your expertise. That was amazing. And now I'm going to invite Mark and Christina to come on video and come off mute. I'm going to be facilitating a bit of a provider discussion, and I'll have each of them do quick introductions of themselves and organizations first, and then we'll get into some questions. So I'll pass it to you, Mark.
All right, thank you, Darla. So my name is Mark Heinert. I'm the Executive Director of YouthWorks. We provide services in North Dakota and West Central Minnesota. Our services really focus on making sure that young people have a safe place to belong and to be heard. So we do have RHY funding, HUD funding that focuses on transitional housing, outreach, emergency shelter, victim services, and the like along those lines. So that's who we are.
Thank you, Mark. And Christina?
Hi there. My name is Christina Carlson, and I'm the CEO at Urban Peak, and we are in Denver, Colorado. We provide services for youth experiencing homelessness ages 12 to 24. And we provide the full convergence of services, including street outreach, drop-in services, shelter. We have this very wild, cool new thing that you should all come see called the Mothership. And then we provide a whole bunch of services, from case management to medical to clinical to education, to employment to workforce development. We are seeing lots of changes in Colorado, and currently are the only folks in the Front Range that are doing youth and minor specific shelter, which is a change in the landscape for us. So we are feeling the change and the pressure as well.
Great, thanks. Well, we're going to dive in. So the first question I posed to Mark and Christina is, what trends are you seeing in your community around policing, ordinances, or criminalization of unhoused youth?
I'll go first on that one. That's okay, Christina. The interesting thing for us, so North Dakota is a relatively rural state. Our entire state has 750,000 people. So putting that into perspective, we've seen the four largest cities, though, pass ordinances anywhere from 3 to 9 months after grants pass. And so the largest communities were saying, hey, we need to pass these ordinances. And what we noticed on the front end is that we were caught off guard. And we shouldn't have been, but we were caught off guard and weren't prepared for that and weren't involved in those conversations. And so our response has been more of a catch-up to meet with law enforcement, to have conversations with community leaders, and discuss how we might help address those challenges without necessarily saying that we're in support of those ordinances. So a couple of specific examples that I've got that are new issues that are happening. In one of our cities in Fargo, there's been a push to move support services out of the downtown area. And so it's been a real hotly contested conversation amongst the city council to try to decide what's the right move. Do we move those services out of the city center? And is there a belief that that's going to cause the homeless individuals to be outside of that area? And that's a challenge. A second challenge that we have is just making sure we're open and honest about the fact that there are legitimately sanitary safety issues that exist with encampments, and how we can have meaningful conversations with public health about what those are and be a part of the solutions to address those particular challenges. So for the unhoused youth in particular, we believe that we have seen more youth go underground, be more couch hopping, less visible. In North Dakota, because we are fairly rural, that has always been the case, but it seems like it's kind of pushed young people even further. And our concern for that it is obvious, and I'm sure all of you are aware of this, but our concern for that is that that is going to place them at higher risks for sex trafficking in particular, because of some of the places that they might be finding that will let them stay there.
Yeah, so I like hearing what's happening other places. It's so fascinating. So I got distracted by that. So in Denver, we have had a camping ban, boy, I think for 9 or 10 years now. And so as have other areas around us or other municipalities. So we've kind of lived with that, and it has depended sort of how hardcore people are or aren't, it's like the wind, things just change. But one of the things that we're seeing in Denver over the last really 2 years, but particularly in the last year, is that Denver is a sanctuary city. And so we saw lots and lots of newcomers coming into our community. I mean, I think, I'm going to get it wrong, but I think at our peak, we were up over 2,000 or something like that a day. I mean, big, big numbers. And that the city responded by opening what they were calling migrant shelters, that kind of stuff. And then it was this sort of statement like, oh, that's not happening anymore. Everybody's gone. And what that meant was that newcomers were really flooding into the homeless system. And the homeless system is not really designed around folks who are undocumented. And so that became a really complicated push-pull. And in terms of youth and seeing unaccompanied youth, there were lots and lots of young people as newcomers coming. And so that has been complicated, not only in terms of folks being in the homeless system, but the criminalization of that sort of being undocumented and experiencing homelessness, that cross-section has been a real challenge to navigate and understand and even identify. Similar to what Mark is saying, I think we also see youth going underground and couch hopping and that kind of stuff more. However, with some of the other shelters that we're providing youth services in Boulder and in Colorado Springs closing, we are seeing our numbers grow and grow and grow and have wait lists. And so, I think while we had maybe early on sort of camping bans and all of that, the new landscape, which has had so much inclusion of for newcomers as well as minors in particular, and we've had a lot of changes in child welfare. And so I would say it's this idea of policy to practice. Like if policy starts in maybe a good place or a bad place or good thinking or poor thinking, and then it just comes into practice, and that becomes really, really challenging to navigate.
Thank you.
I see the question around house keys. Yes, we know he's and has done a lot, and I know that they work very hard to help to change some of the policies that the city level are experiencing. It's a great resource.
Gotcha. So what actions has your organization taken to push back against criminalization policies?
Want me to go first again, Christina? I got it. So
Sure.
YouthWorks has done several things. The first and foremost is making sure that we're an active participant in our local homeless coalitions, because this isn't just a youth issue. This is a community issue for individuals that are homeless. And so we've joined in local and statewide coalition efforts to have a unified voice and to speak up about what our concerns are with the policies. So that's first. The second one would be making sure that we're having conversations on a relationship level with those that are enacting or following through with these law enforcement and the city municipality, whether that be county or city municipality that's working on that. Some of our response to push back has been education after the fact, because there's a couple of the ordinance that were just happening, and we then had to talk about what could be done to help do harm reduction. How do we help make this a little bit more effective? So a good example of that is we had a community that passed the legislation, and then we made sure we connected with the local sheriff's department and offered to be a part of going with the law enforcement when they are serving these notices. And so that's not ideal. I'm not suggesting that that's a good situation, but I think it's important to know that even under restrictive laws, that we can insert some type of care into that enforcement, and we can help to preserve young people's dignity, and we can help improve that circumstance or situation. It literally is the definition of what many of us have done our whole careers, which is harm reduction and street outreach and trying to support. So our preference is to provide housing and to get people connected to housing. But there are times when we also have to pivot, I think, and figure out how we can make the most of these challenging situations.
Maybe all trainings moving forward, Darla, should just be called a pivot. They could be like, who's pivoting and how fast? So there are interesting things happening in Denver at a broader level. And so I'll start. There's a group called the Homeless Leadership Council, which is most of the major homeless providers. So from Catholic Charities, Salvation Army, the Denver Rescue Mission, Gathering Place, Dolores, Volunteers of America. You know, there's a big group of us that meet as providers, and then we also meet with the city as a group. And that's been a way for us to sort of say, like, hey, this is what we're seeing on the ground. And when there's this type of enforcement, this is the impact on who we're serving. It also has provided a really important way for some communication to come to us as providers. You know, if it's like, oh, hey, you know, we're all really worried about ICE, here's some resources. It's been a place for the city to provide sort of best practices, much like we get from the National Network or Youth Collaboratory or other organizations. It's been a way for the city to do that. And it was really impactful during COVID, particularly when there was so much, when the public health orders changed every 5 minutes. Maybe you were going to die for COVID and maybe you weren't, or God knows what was going to happen. So that was something that existed that sort of zooms out and takes not just a look at what's happening for youth, but for ideally most organizations serving folks who are experiencing homelessness. The other piece is that when we, the Mothership, which is our new project, we have non-congregate shelter, and then we have basically a type of bridge housing that are like shared living and dining, shared community spaces, and then rooms for roommates. That has allowed us to group people by affinity group. So when I go back to serving newcomers, it's created space where we could have folks with shared experiences or shared needs or something grouped together. And that has provided some ways for us to communicate specifically to groups, you know, like, hey, this is what's going to happen and you all should be here. And we want to connect you with legal services or folks to help you get enrolled in your SNAP benefits faster, or those kinds of things. We've done a lot of staff training around, like, if let's say the National Guard was going to show up, what would you do? Or if ICE is going to show up, who do you call? What are your know your rights? Like those kinds of things. And so I think it's that really complicated piece, at least for me personally, is always around, like, what do we do to serve the people we need in a safe way, and so we can continue to provide services, and how do we advocate, or how do we partner with advocacy organizations while we do the service delivery. It's such a complicated dance. And so I often think the part where maybe we try to double down or triple down is really like a provision of information. How do we provide accurate information to the youth we serve? How do we provide accurate information to our funders and partners? And how do we provide it to our staff? And I think, you know, particularly when the newest rounds of executive orders came out, it was, I sort of say it was like COVID PTSD. It'd be like, oh God, it's like COVID again, because this happened and this, but I mean, really trying to get real information and true information so we knew our rights, and then more importantly, the youth we serve know theirs.
Thank you. We are going back to our final lightning round because we have a lot of questions and 11 minutes. So you get 1 minute. So, and I know I'm asking a lot. So it's a big question. So how can organizations strengthen their advocacy while balancing direct service demands? You all have a lot on your plate. What final words of advice or inspiration do you have?
We need to work in youth empowerment to the service delivery scheme. So we're empowering young people to address their individual challenges while at the same time we're addressing macro level issues. There's the only way to do it because there isn't enough time, money, resources to do them separately. And so on top of that, because we know that youth empowerment works, positive youth development works, relationships matter, it's important for us to give youth the opportunity to have those relationships with those people that are the decision makers. How do we get out of the young people's way? How do we give them the opportunity to do some of the advocacy? And how is that going to balance our ability to do the work? It's both. Do both at the same time.
Thank you, Mark.
Ditto. How about that? That saved you a minute. Ditto.
Oh, awesome. Well, thank you to Mark and Christina. We're going to move to Q&A and a final plug for our summit before I'm going to shut down the slides so we can see each other. I think I can do this. Stop sharing the slides. Okay. So hopefully we can see each other more. Folks have been putting a lot of questions in chat. And I do want to give a shout out to a National Homelessness Law Center toolkit that they, for places that are preparing for federal takeovers. They're keeping it a bit close to the vest, but if you would like a copy of it, or if your city has been threatened with a federal takeover, Katie did put Eric Tarr's emails in chat, so please check that out. I'm going to shift us to questions. And I think the first one is for Katie. What is the National Homelessness Law Center thoughts regarding efforts to keep low barrier policies such as Housing First, but funding being tied towards higher barrier policies?
Yeah, it's such a tough one. I mean, I think this really goes into looking into whatever your particular funding stream is. Do you have something in law or regulation that you can kind of hang your hat on where Housing First is required or encouraged in your program? And that could create kind of a protective effect, even if, like, you know, HUD is coming against you and saying, no, you're not supposed to do that. Well, actually, we are. Here it is in the statute. It at least gives you a hook if you need to, like, defend against a defunding situation. But I would say, like, this is where I would be just really pushing towards state, local funding. If you're in a friendly jurisdiction towards Housing First, like seeing, are there other avenues where you can get funding, whether that's private funding as well, to kind of keep implementing Housing First, even if you have to, with your federal funding, restrict things a bit. I just don't know that there's any other way. It's kind of like legal challenges or different streams of funding.
Yeah, 100%. So I knew this question was going to come up. So this is a question for N and for Y. So the recent Family and Youth Services Bureau, ACF, announcements indicated that communities that criminalize homelessness would be prioritized. And they were shocked to learn this weekend that their transitional living program was funded again under the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act in the Chicago area. So certainly it seems that program requirements they're communicating verbally have very little merit in terms of the programs that they're actually funding. And they asked if NN4Y has a geographic sense of distribution of awards. Yeah, we are seeing like liberal progressive states getting RHYA grants. We don't have a full sense of, who's been, who's been rejected and who hasn't. We did launch a survey yesterday. I don't know if we can share it in chat, Kayla, where we are asking providers who did submit an RHYA grant to let us know if they got it or not and where they're located. And if they know or ever find out what their score was out of 100, to please let us know. We are trying to track and document what is actually going on, behind the scenes, behind the cloak and veil. It's hard. Things aren't public. They haven't published a list yet, but please, Trinity just put the link. So if you did apply for a Runaway and Homeless Youth Act grant, filling that out will really help us with intel. They say it's a potentially silly question, but there are no silly questions here because we're all learning and growing, as Dane told us we must continue to do. Wise Dane. So the question is at what age do you still qualify as a youth with lived experience, but who is doing the advocacy work or working for the agencies? And do some agencies have policies about how long you need to be no longer receiving their particular services before you employ a young person? So any advice from Dane as a young person with lived expertise, or anybody else on the call want to share their perspective?
I mean, I was just going to say, just maybe to answer it briefly, like, I think that is something to think carefully about. And if you're going to go a route of having someone on the board that's currently receiving services versus having a waiting period, like you better approach it really intentionally because it's can have lots of implications. And I see Dane went on camera, so I'll pass it to Zim.
I think the biggest point that I would always want to speak to when it comes to trying to navigate a client slash advocate or employee in those spaces is that the idea of time and place. It's like when you see a coworker in the grocery store, you're not going to ask them about the deadline tomorrow. You're going to ask them about the apples in their cart. Because in that moment, they're not an employee. They're a person experiencing the same things that you do, needing the same things that you do. Myself as a client, there are a lot of things that I need. There are a lot of things that I, present myself differently as outside of being a professional, speaking to these people in my community who I've worked with, because that is who I am, not how I advocate. And professionally, I don't, do the things that I would do showing up to a case manager appointment, like showing up in sweatpants and, like raiding the snack drawer. There's a person and then there's a profession. And I think when we try to mash those two things together just because it is a youth that we see as a client, it not only muddies the waters, but it also makes it a lot more difficult to get work done, to give them services or to improve services. There's no lines, there's no boundaries, there's no true understanding of protocol and procedure. It's just all messed up. And it kind of takes away the ability to be a professional from someone who is acting as professional.
Thank you, Dane.
If I might chime in too, I think there's also the difference between advisory versus action. So a youth advisory board or a one-time, we're going to seek feedback on a panel versus ongoing. And so I would agree with Dane's point that if it's going to be ongoing, that would be a different role versus I'm looking to elicit feedback and to get some perspective on things. I think that could be done differently.
All right, lots more questions. Thank you both. Katie, there's a question around if the National Homelessness Law Center has experimented with less academic language for building broader support to anti-criminalization. Youth living with them have frequently been requesting that they speak more clearly and colloquially. And I think this gets to kind of like, what is the effective messaging? If we're not just talking to ourselves in the homelessness space, we're already passionate, invested, we're working to end homelessness and youth homelessness. I think you guys are doing some narrative change work, but what do you want to share around that?
Our comms person hates working with us as
Yeah.
attorneys. It's kind of a nightmare. Yeah, we do very intentionally, for most of the stuff on the youth homelessness side, at least, try to keep like the 8th grade reading level like as a strict requirement. And as much as we can, put stuff in plain language. We actually train our pro bono attorneys who do research for us to try to translate stuff into plain language. It is a constant struggle. So what I would just say too is, like, if there is any resource that we've put out that you are like, this is too much, it's not good, like, we will take that feedback. You will not insult us. We are not offended. Like, please, we will be happy to try to translate things down into much more plainer speak.
And while I have you, Katie, is there any upcoming SCOTUS cases that we should keep an eye on in this realm?
Not yet,
Okay.
but yeah, we'll try to put the alert out when it is. I mean, these things are all going to wind their way up to the Supreme Court. All the challenges about the funding stuff, I'm sure.
Yeah. And this is, for, any of our panelists. So given the sharp divides in political perspectives, which everybody's aware of, what approaches are most effective for advocates working on housing issues to engage with lawmakers and to respond to policy changes, such as those, highlighted in HUD's recent announcement, and HUD's recent statement clearly shows their position. What advice do you guys have to really engage with both sides of the aisle in these days?
I mean, it shouldn't sound silly. It's authentic.
Yeah.
Let's talk about who we serve and why we do it and what the needs are, and remind every side of the aisle, or whatever it is, that we're talking about young people who have experienced a lot of trauma and are vulnerable and are amazing and funny and deserving. And, let's just talk about who we work with and, get out of the rest of it and be like, we care about humans, you care about humans, we're all humans. It's a complex issue, but let's get back to talking about people. And that, I get that that's not always effective or perfect, but maybe it's a way to cut back the noise and remind people of what we're doing.
Thank you. I realize we're 1 minute over, but Dane, you went off camera. Any final words of wisdom before I wrap us up?
Don't set me up like that. That puts so much pressure. Come on now. Wow. I just wanted to make the point from a lived experience advocate who's visibly a minority. I've learned that they're already expecting me to throw anecdotal, like, emotional information towards them because they're so offended by me being a minority and their own emotions. And so something that I've learned is kind of using that momentum to push statistics and facts first. And it's kind of just carried by the fact that I'm existing there as I typically push harder with, this is exactly the kind of information that's rock solid and you can't argue with. You can argue with me when I say that I believe that young queer people deserve safety, but there might be, most likely are, people politically who are not going to agree with that statement. But the statistic of how much more dangerous it is to be a young queer person and how much harder we would have to work to protect that person is indisputable. There's nothing that you can say other than agreeing with those numbers. And it makes that's kind of an easier lead in to be able to add to the context of how important that group is. I hate that I have to, use numbers before people, but unfortunately not everyone that high up cares very much. So I learned as an advocate to be able to use the information that they also don't expect you to have because you're not a provider, to open their eyes and their ears to what you're trying to say.
Thank you, Dane. That's so valuable and important. Okay, I'm sorry, we're 3 minutes over, but I want to thank all of our experts for sharing their information, sharing their expertise, sharing their time to be here today. Thank you all for joining us, recording. Everything will be available. Survey will be sent out, all the resources. Thank you all. Take care of yourself and be well.
Recording stopped.